Picture this scene and really let it sink into your brain, because everything you know about the modern world is about to get flipped upside down and shaken until the coins fall out of its pockets. It is the morning of December 8, 1941, and President Franklin D. Roosevelt is standing before Congress delivering his famous Day of Infamy speech about the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. But in this version of history something different happens, something that changes absolutely everything about the world you and I live in today. Because in our timeline America rose from the ashes of Pearl Harbor like an industrial phoenix and crushed both Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan with the combined fury of democracy and really big bombs. But what if that never happened? What if the decisions made in those crucial months and years went differently? What if the battles that shaped our world had different outcomes? What if the atomic bomb never worked or never got built at all? What if America simply lost World War II and had to sue for peace with enemies that showed no mercy to anyone who opposed them? The world you would wake up in would be so fundamentally different from the one you know that your morning coffee routine would be illegal, your internet access would be non-existent, and depending on your ancestry there is a very real chance you would never have been born at all. This is not some fantasy scenario cooked up by bored historians. This is a deep dive into the actual strategic turning points that could have gone the other way and the cascading consequences that would have reshaped human civilization in ways that make dystopian fiction look optimistic by comparison. So buckle up, because we are about to explore the darkest timeline that almost was, and thank whatever forces you believe in that it never came to pass. To understand how America could have lost World War II, we first need to understand just how close some of those crucial moments actually were, because Hollywood has conditioned us to believe that the Allied victory was somehow inevitable, that the good guys always win in the end. But the reality is that World War II was balanced on a knife edge at multiple points, and the slightest push in the wrong direction could have sent history tumbling into an abyss from which there would be no recovery. And the scary thing is that many of these turning points came down to individual decisions, lucky breaks, or accidents of timing that could have easily gone the other way. So let us start at the beginning and work our way through the nightmare scenarios that thankfully remain theoretical. The first major divergence point is Pearl Harbor itself and the decisions made by Japanese Admiral Chuichi Nagumo in the hours after the initial attack. In our timeline, Nagumo launched 2 waves of aircraft against the American Pacific Fleet and achieved devastating success, sinking or damaging 8 battleships and killing over 2,400 Americans in a single morning. But what most people do not realize is that Nagumo held back a 3rd wave of aircraft that could have targeted the fuel storage facilities, repair docks, and submarine base at Pearl Harbor. His subordinates begged him to launch this 3rd wave because they understood that destroying the fuel would cripple the Pacific Fleet for years. The 4.5 million barrels of oil stored at Pearl Harbor represented the entire fuel supply for the Pacific Fleet, and there were no adequate replacement facilities anywhere in the Pacific. If Nagumo had launched that 3rd wave and destroyed those fuel tanks, the American carriers that escaped the attack would have had nowhere to refuel. Midway would have been impossible, Guadalcanal would have been impossible, the entire Pacific War would have played out on Japanese terms with American forces pushed back to the west coast. So imagine this scenario playing out with Japan controlling everything west of Hawaii and the resources to fuel their expansion for years to come. But destroying the fuel tanks was only the beginning of what could have gone wrong, because the biggest mistake Japan made at Pearl Harbor was failing to catch the American aircraft carriers in port. The USS Enterprise, USS Lexington, and USS Saratoga were all at sea during the attack, and these carriers would go on to turn the tide of the Pacific War. But what if they had been in port? What if Admiral Kimmel had not sent them out on exercises? What if the Japanese had arrived one day later when at least some of the carriers were scheduled to return? The loss of those carriers combined with the destruction of the fuel facilities would have left America with essentially no offensive capability in the Pacific for at least 2 years, enough time for Japan to consolidate their conquests, fortify their defensive perimeter, and make any American counteroffensive prohibitively costly. In this nightmare scenario, Japan would control the Philippines, Indonesia, Malaysia, Burma, the Dutch East Indies, and potentially Australia and New Zealand, with the resources of half the world's rubber supply, massive oil reserves, and strategic metals that Japan desperately needed. Their war machine would become self-sustaining rather than the resource-starved beast that historically burned itself out. Now let us shift our attention to Europe, because the Pacific was only half of America's war and arguably the less important half in terms of global consequences. Germany's position in 1942 was incredibly strong. They controlled continental Europe from the Atlantic to the gates of Moscow. Their U-boats were sinking Allied shipping faster than it could be replaced. And the Soviet Union was reeling from losses that would have destroyed any other nation on Earth. the turning point came at Stalingrad in the winter of 1942 to 1943 when the German Sixth Army was encircled and destroyed. But what if it was not? What if Hitler had listened to his generals and allowed a tactical withdrawal rather than demanding that his troops fight to the last man? What if the German relief attempt had succeeded? What if the Soviet counteroffensive had been delayed by just a few weeks, allowing the Germans to dig in for winter? Stalingrad was not inevitable, it was the result of German overconfidence, Soviet desperation, and a brutal winter that favored the defenders. Any number of small changes could have resulted in a German victory or at least a stalemate that preserved the Sixth Army for future operations, and without the catastrophic losses at Stalingrad, Germany would have retained the offensive capability to potentially knock the Soviet Union out of the war entirely. The scenario that terrified Allied planners more than anything else was the possibility of a separate peace between Germany and the Soviet Union. Stalin was nothing if not pragmatic, and he had already signed one deal with Hitler before Operation Barbarossa. If the military situation became hopeless, there was every reason to believe he might sign another. Imagine a scenario where the Soviet Union agrees to an armistice in late 1942, ceding Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states to German control in exchange for peace. Germany would suddenly have access to the Ukrainian breadbasket and could redirect millions of soldiers from the Eastern Front to defend against any Allied invasion in the West. The Atlantic Wall would be manned by battle-hardened veterans rather than second-line troops. The Luftwaffe could concentrate its fighters against Allied bomber formations, and the U-boat campaign could continue without diversion of resources to the Eastern Front. In this scenario, D-Day becomes impossible, not difficult but genuinely impossible, because the Allied forces simply would not have the capability to overcome German defenses that were 10 times stronger than what they historically faced. Speaking of D-Day, let us talk about just how close that operation came to failure even in our timeline, because Operation Overlord was one of the most complex military operations in human history, and there were at least a dozen points where everything could have gone catastrophically wrong. The weather on June 6, 1944 was terrible, and Eisenhower came within hours of postponing the invasion, but he received a forecast suggesting a brief window of acceptable conditions and made the decision to go. What if that forecast had been wrong? What if the weather had been worse than predicted? What if the seas had been too rough for the landing craft and thousands of soldiers had drowned before reaching the beaches? What if the airborne operations had been even more scattered than they were and failed to secure the crucial bridges and crossroads? The German defenders came terrifyingly close to throwing the Allies back into the sea at Omaha Beach, where American casualties exceeded 2,000 in just a few hours of fighting. And at several points the operation was balanced on a knife edge, with commanders considering withdrawal. If the Germans had possessed accurate intelligence about the landing sites, if Rommel had been present on June 6 rather than in Germany for his wife's birthday, if the panzer divisions had been released earlier, the outcome could have been very different. Let us explore what would have happened if D-Day had failed, because this is one of the most consequential alternative history scenarios imaginable. A failed D-Day would have been a catastrophe beyond anything the Allies experienced in the war. We are talking about potential losses of 100,000 men or more, the destruction of the carefully built invasion fleet, and the psychological blow of demonstrating that Fortress Europe was impenetrable. The political consequences would have been immediate and severe. Winston Churchill's government would have faced a vote of no confidence. Franklin Roosevelt's chances of winning the 1944 election would have been damaged, and the pressure for a negotiated peace would have become overwhelming. The American public had been told that D-Day was the beginning of the end, that victory in Europe was just months away. A failure would have shattered that confidence and raised questions about whether the war was even winnable. Meanwhile, Germany would have been able to transfer divisions from France to reinforce the Eastern Front. The V-1 and V-2 bombardment of England would have continued and intensified, and Hitler would have gained the time he needed to deploy his wonder weapons in greater numbers. And this brings us to the atomic bomb, which is perhaps the single most important factor in how World War II ended. The Manhattan Project was the largest scientific endeavor in human history up to that point, employing over 125,000 people and costing nearly $2 billion. But nuclear weapons were not inevitable. They were the result of specific decisions and specific breakthroughs that could easily have gone differently. Germany had its own atomic program, and while historians now know it was never close to producing a weapon, Allied planners at the time were terrified that Hitler might get the bomb first. But the more interesting alternative history is one where nobody gets the bomb, where the Manhattan Project fails or is delayed by years. The scientific challenges of building an atomic bomb were immense, and at several points the project nearly failed. What if the graphite used in the first reactor had been contaminated and the chain reaction had not worked? What if the implosion design for the plutonium bomb had never been solved? What if the uranium enrichment process had been too slow to produce enough material before the war ended? Without atomic weapons, the invasion of Japan would have proceeded as planned. Operation Downfall would have landed American troops on the Japanese home islands in late 1945 and early 1946, and the casualties would have been staggering. American military planners estimated that the invasion would cost between 500,000 and 1 million American casualties, with Japanese losses potentially reaching into the tens of millions. The war might have continued into 1947 or 1948, and by the time it ended, America would have been so exhausted that its ability to shape the post-war world would have been severely diminished. Now let us really dive into the nightmare scenario and explore what the world would look like if America had somehow lost or been forced to accept a negotiated peace that left the Axis powers in control of their conquests. This is where alternative history becomes genuinely disturbing, because we have to grapple with what a Nazi-dominated Europe and Japanese-dominated Asia would have looked like, and the answer is nothing short of apocalyptic for hundreds of millions of people. The Holocaust was not some aberration of German policy that would have ended with the war. It was the central ideological project of the Nazi regime, and victory would have allowed them to carry it to completion and beyond. In our timeline, the Nazis murdered approximately 6 million Jews, but their plans called for the complete elimination of all Jews under German control, estimated at 11 million people according to the minutes of the Wannsee Conference. A German victory would have meant the deaths of every single Jewish person in Europe, along with the Roma, Slavic intellectuals, disabled individuals, homosexuals, political prisoners, and anyone else deemed unworthy of life by Nazi racial ideology. But the Holocaust was only the beginning of Nazi plans for occupied Europe, because the General Plan Ost called for the deliberate depopulation of Eastern Europe to make room for German settlers. The plan called for the elimination of 50 to 60% of Russians, 50% of Estonians, 50% of Latvians, 75% of Belarusians, 65% of Ukrainians, and 75% of Lithuanians. We are talking about the planned murder of roughly 100 million people, and these were not vague aspirations but detailed administrative plans that specified how many people would be killed, how many would be deported to Siberia, and how many would be kept alive as slave labor. The Nazi vision for Europe was a continent depopulated of its indigenous inhabitants and resettled by Germanic peoples, with the surviving Slavic population reduced to a helot class serving German masters. This was the future that Allied soldiers were fighting to prevent, and it is a future that would have been realized if the war had ended differently. Let us talk about what Nazi victory would have meant for the occupied populations of Western Europe, because while the genocide was focused primarily on Eastern Europe, the Western countries would not have escaped Nazi plans for reorganization. France would have been permanently divided, with the Atlantic coast and northern regions annexed directly into the Reich, while a collaborationist rump state continued in the south. The French would have been encouraged to emigrate to their African colonies to make room for German settlers, and French culture and language would have been systematically suppressed in the annexed territories. Belgium would have been partitioned along linguistic lines, with Flanders incorporated into a Greater German Reich and Wallonia becoming part of a dependent French state. The Netherlands would have been annexed entirely as a Germanic nation suitable for integration, and the Dutch resistance fighters who historically risked their lives to hide Jews and Allied airmen would have been hunted down and executed along with their families. Norway and Denmark would have been transformed into German protectorates, with their governments reduced to administrative puppets carrying out Berlin's orders, and the process of Germanization would have proceeded methodically over decades until the very memory of national independence faded. The fate of Britain in a Nazi victory scenario is a subject of considerable historical debate, because Hitler had complex and often contradictory feelings about the British Empire. On one hand, he admired what he saw as the Anglo-Saxon racial achievement of building a global empire. On the other hand, he despised British democracy and the influence of what he termed Jewish finance on British policy. The most likely scenario in the event of American withdrawal from the war would have been a negotiated peace that left Britain nominally independent but strategically impotent. Germany would have demanded the return of former German colonies, restrictions on British naval power, and probably economic concessions that would have made Britain a de facto German satellite. The British Empire would have been allowed to continue in some form as a useful mechanism for controlling global resources, but actual policy would have been dictated from Berlin. Over time, the British Isles would have been drawn into the German economic sphere, and the fiction of independence would have become increasingly hollow, and the British people who had fought so hard and suffered so much during the Blitz would have found that their sacrifices had been for nothing. Now let us cross the Atlantic and discuss what would have happened to the United States itself in a scenario where America lost or was forced to negotiate peace. And this is where we need to be very careful about our assumptions, because losing a war is not the same as being conquered. The geographical position of the United States, protected by two vast oceans, meant that actual invasion was essentially impossible even for a victorious Axis alliance. The German Navy never had the capability to project power across the Atlantic in sufficient force to threaten the American coastline. And while Japan demonstrated the ability to strike American territory, the idea of occupying the continental United States was never realistic. What we are really talking about when we discuss America losing World War II is a scenario where the United States is forced to accept a peace that leaves the Axis powers in control of their conquests and withdraws from the Eastern Hemisphere. This would have been a tremendous blow to American prestige and power, but it would not have meant Nazi troops marching down Pennsylvania Avenue. The immediate consequences of such a peace would have been primarily psychological and political. The isolationist movement that had opposed American entry into the war would have been vindicated in their warnings about the costs of foreign entanglement, and the political figures who had pushed for intervention would have been discredited and removed from power. Franklin Roosevelt would not have survived the political fallout of a failed war, and his domestic programs would have been rolled back by a Republican Congress determined to punish the Democrats for leading America into disaster. The New Deal coalition that shaped American politics for a generation would have shattered, and the political trajectory of the United States would have turned sharply rightward, but the more significant consequences would have been strategic and economic. America would have found itself isolated in a world dominated by hostile powers, with trade routes controlled by German and Japanese navies and access to crucial resources dependent on the goodwill of regimes that had every reason to resent American opposition to their rise. The loss of access to global markets would have fundamentally restructured the American economy, because the prosperity of the post-war era was built on American dominance of international trade, with the dollar as the global reserve currency and American corporations operating freely across the world. In a defeated America, this entire system would never have emerged. Instead, the United States would have been forced to develop an autarkic economy focused on self-sufficiency and hemispheric trade. The good neighbor policy in Latin America would have taken on desperate urgency as America sought to secure access to resources it could no longer obtain from the Eastern Hemisphere. Rubber from Brazil, tin from Bolivia, copper from Chile, these would have become the lifelines of American industry. But even with complete dominance of the Western Hemisphere, America would have been a diminished power, unable to project force beyond its own neighborhood and perpetually on guard against Axis encroachment into its sphere of influence. The social and cultural consequences of defeat would have been equally profound, because war and its outcome shape national character in ways that persist for generations. The United States that emerged from World War II victory was confident, expansive, and convinced of its own exceptional destiny. Americans believed they had saved the world from tyranny and that this achievement entitled them to global leadership. Defeated America would have developed a very different national psychology, one marked by humiliation, bitterness, and a sense of betrayal. The troops who came home from a lost war would not have been celebrated as the greatest generation, but mourned as the victims of political failure, and the social cohesion that wartime victory created would have been replaced by recrimination and division. Who lost the war would have become the defining political question of the post-war era, with accusations flying between isolationists who blamed interventionists for getting America into an unwinnable conflict and interventionists who blamed isolationists for preventing the full mobilization that might have achieved victory. The civil rights movement that transformed American society in the 1950s and 1960s would have taken a very different path in this scenario, because the historical movement drew significant momentum from the contradiction between fighting for democracy abroad while denying it to Black Americans at home. African American soldiers who served with distinction in World War II returned home unwilling to accept second-class citizenship, and their activism combined with international pressure and changing social attitudes to force progress on civil rights. In a defeated America, these dynamics would have been inverted. A discredited liberal establishment would have lacked the political capital to challenge Southern segregation. The international pressure that historically came from Cold War competition for the allegiance of newly independent nations would have been absent, and the bitterness of defeat might well have intensified racial scapegoating as Americans looked for someone to blame for their humiliation. The most optimistic scenario is that civil rights progress would have been delayed by decades. The pessimistic scenario is that American race relations might have moved backward towards something resembling the apartheid systems that other defeated powers developed. Let us now examine what a Nazi-dominated world would have looked like decades after the war, because victory in World War II would have validated Nazi ideology in ways that would have strengthened the regime and allowed it to pursue its goals without external constraint. The internal contradictions of the Nazi system that historians have identified were real, but they were not necessarily fatal to the regime. Nazi Germany was a chaotic governance nightmare with overlapping jurisdictions and competing power centers. But this was a feature rather than a bug. Hitler deliberately created competition among his subordinates to prevent any of them from becoming powerful enough to threaten him, and there is no reason to believe this system would have collapsed on its own. The Soviet Union, after all, maintained a dysfunctional command economy for 70 years through sheer political will, and Nazi Germany possessed resources and capabilities that the Soviets never matched. The question of what would have happened after Hitler's death is crucial to any long-term alternative. History, because Hitler was the indispensable man of the Nazi regime and much of its character reflected his personal obsessions and prejudices, but the idea that Nazism would have moderated after Hitler's death is almost certainly wrong. The men who surrounded Hitler were true believers in the ideology, and their competition for power would have been based on who could best embody Nazi principles rather than who could reform them. Hermann Göring, Heinrich Himmler, Martin Bormann, Joseph Goebbels. Any of these men would have continued the policies of racial warfare and territorial expansion that defined the Nazi project. The Holocaust would have been completed, General Plan Ost would have been implemented, and the German Reich would have settled into the bloody work of reorganizing an entire continent according to racial principles. The only question is whether the successor regime would have been stable enough to maintain control, or whether internal power struggles would have created opportunities for resistance. The technological trajectory of a Nazi-dominated world is a fascinating question, because German science and engineering were genuinely impressive in many fields, but the regime's ideological blinders created significant blind spots. The most famous example is the rejection of Jewish physics, which included Einstein's relativity and much of quantum mechanics. In our timeline, this self-imposed handicap was limited in its effects because the war ended before it could fully manifest, but in a long-running Nazi regime the consequences would have been severe. Physics would have stagnated as German scientists pursued dead ends approved by ideological authorities, and the fundamental research that underlies modern technology would have been crippled. There would have been no German transistor, no German integrated circuit, no German computer revolution, because these technologies all depended on quantum mechanics that Nazi ideology rejected. The irony is that by purging Jewish scientists and rejecting Jewish physics, the Nazis would have ensured their long-term technological decline even as they achieved short-term military victory. But let us not underestimate Nazi technological capability in the areas they prioritized, because German rocket science was genuinely world-leading, and without American and Soviet competition to drive space exploration in a Cold War context, the Germans might have been the first to the moon. Wernher von Braun and his team would have continued developing larger and more capable rockets, and a Nazi moon landing in the 1960s or 1970s is entirely plausible. The difference is that this would have been a prestige project rather than a genuine scientific endeavor, designed to demonstrate Aryan superiority rather than advance human knowledge. The scientific return would have been minimal because the ideological framework would have prevented honest inquiry, but the propaganda value would have been immense. Nazi footage of Germanic astronauts planting the swastika on the lunar surface would have been broadcast around the world as proof of the natural superiority of the master race, and populations living under Nazi occupation would have been reminded once again of the futility of resistance. The nuclear question looms large over any alternative history of World War II because atomic weapons fundamentally changed the nature of international relations. In our timeline, the United States' monopoly on nuclear weapons from 1945 to 1949 was a crucial factor in establishing the post-war order, but in a scenario where America loses the war, the atomic situation becomes much more complex. If the Manhattan Project succeeded but America was already seeking peace, the decision to use atomic weapons becomes incredibly fraught. Using nuclear weapons on Japan or Germany after a negotiated peace was already being discussed would have been seen as a war crime of unprecedented magnitude. The political will to do so might not have existed, especially if the American public was already war-weary and eager for peace, and the strategic benefit would have been unclear if the overall war was already lost. Alternatively, if the Manhattan Project failed or was delayed, the nuclear age might have dawned under very different circumstances. with Nazi Germany or Imperial Japan potentially being the first to develop atomic weapons. A Nazi atomic bomb is a particularly terrifying scenario. Because unlike the United States, which developed nuclear weapons in the context of democratic institutions and then struggled with the moral implications, Nazi Germany would have had no such compunctions. Hitler explicitly called for weapons of genocide, and a Nazi atomic bomb would have been used without hesitation against any population deemed racially inferior or politically resistant. Imagine atomic weapons being used not to end a war quickly but as a tool of colonial pacification, dropped on rebellious populations to demonstrate the impossibility of resistance. The Atlantic Charter's vision of self-determination for all peoples would have been rendered meaningless by German control of weapons against which there was no defense, and the world would have settled into a dark stability based on the certainty that resistance to Nazi rule meant annihilation. Let us shift our attention now to the Pacific theater and examine what Japanese victory would have meant for the peoples of Asia. Because while Nazi plans for Europe were horrifying enough, Japanese militarism was responsible for its own catalogue of atrocities that would have continued and expanded in victory. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere was presented as an anti-colonial project that would liberate Asian peoples from Western imperialism, but the reality was a brutal Japanese empire that treated other Asians as subhuman. The Rape of Nanjing. The Bataan Death March, Unit 731's biological experiments. The Comfort Women system. These were not aberrations but logical expressions of an ideology that viewed non-Japanese as inherently inferior. Japanese victory would have meant the institutionalization of these practices across a vast Asian empire stretching from Manchuria to the Dutch East Indies. The population of China would have faced the most severe consequences because Japanese war aims explicitly included the subjugation of China and the exploitation of Chinese resources and labor for Japanese benefit. The war in China had already killed millions of Chinese civilians through combat, massacre, and deliberate starvation, and victory would have allowed Japan to implement its plans for Chinese colonization without interference. Japanese settlers would have been established in Manchuria and northern China. Chinese resistance leaders would have been hunted down and executed, and the Chinese population would have been reduced to a labor force serving Japanese economic interests. The cultural genocide that Tibet would later experience under Chinese rule gives some indication of what Chinese populations might have faced under Japanese occupation, as Japan sought to eliminate any basis for national identity that might fuel future resistance. Chinese language and culture would have been suppressed. Chinese history would have been rewritten to emphasize Japanese racial superiority, and generations of Chinese children would have been raised to believe in their own inferiority. Korea's fate under continued Japanese rule is particularly painful to contemplate because the Korean peninsula had already experienced decades of Japanese colonization and the forced assimilation policies that sought to eliminate Korean identity entirely. Koreans were required to adopt Japanese names, speak Japanese, and worship at Shinto shrines. Korean language and culture were suppressed, and Korean women were forced into sexual slavery as comfort women. Japanese victory would have meant the continuation and intensification of these policies. Today's Korean cultural renaissance with K-pop, Korean cinema, and Korean cuisine celebrated around the world would never have happened because Korean culture would have been systematically destroyed. The Korean people would have been absorbed into the Japanese empire not as citizens but as a subordinate caste, their separate identity erased over generations until even the memory of Korea as an independent nation faded into myth. Southeast Asia under Japanese domination would have experienced exploitation on a massive scale because the region's resources were precisely what Japan went to war to control. The rubber of Malaysia, the oil of Indonesia, the rice of Indochina, these would have been extracted for Japanese benefit with little regard for local populations. The famines that occurred under Japanese occupation during the war would have been normalized as the cost of development, and the infrastructure projects that Japan undertook would have been designed to facilitate resource extraction rather than improve local living standards. The nationalist movements that historically achieved independence after World War II would have been crushed, their leaders executed or imprisoned, and their followers subjected to the harsh pacification campaigns that characterized Japanese colonial rule. Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Burma, the Philippines, all of these nations that celebrate Independence Days would instead be Japanese colonial territories, their populations working to enrich a distant metropole that viewed them as racial inferiors. Australia and New Zealand occupy an interesting position in Pacific alternative history because these nations were genuinely threatened by Japanese expansion, and their fate in a Japanese victory scenario is hotly debated. full Japanese invasion and occupation of Australia would have been logistically extremely difficult given the vast distances involved and the challenges of supplying occupation forces, but a negotiated peace that left Japan in control of Southeast Asia would have fundamentally changed the strategic position of Australia and New Zealand. Cut off from their traditional protector Britain and facing a triumphant Japanese empire to their north, these nations would have had to accommodate themselves to the new reality. This might have meant formal neutrality and economic concessions to Japan, or it might have meant something closer to satellite status with Australian and New Zealand foreign policy determined in Tokyo. The proud Anzac tradition of military service and the democratic institutions that define these nations today might well have withered under the pressure of accommodating a victorious authoritarian neighbor. The Indian subcontinent presents one of the most complex scenarios in Pacific alternative history because Japanese forces never actually invaded India, though they came close in the Imperial campaign of 1944. In a scenario where Japan wins the Pacific War, India's fate depends heavily on whether Britain is also defeated in Europe. If Britain falls or is forced into satellite status, then India. But this independence would come under the shadow of Japanese power and would likely have been influenced by the collaboration between some Indian nationalists and Japan during the war. Subhas Chandra Bose and his Indian National Army fought alongside Japan in the hope of liberating India from British rule, and a Japanese victory would have vindicated this approach. The India that emerged from such a scenario would likely have been more authoritarian and more hostile to Western influence than the democratic India that actually developed, and the religious partition that created Pakistan might have played out very differently without British supervision. Now let us zoom out and consider the global implications of Axis victory, because the world order that emerged from World War II was not simply a political arrangement but a comprehensive system of international relations, economics, and values that has shaped everything about modern life: the United Nations, the international human rights regime, the Bretton Woods economic system, the decolonization of Africa and Asia, the spread of democracy, the modern conception of war crimes and crimes against humanity. All of these emerged from Allied victory and the determination to create a world in which the horrors of World War II could never be repeated. In an Axis victory scenario, none of this happens. Instead, the world divides into spheres of influence dominated by regimes that explicitly reject human rights, democracy, and the equality of peoples. The international economic system under Axis domination would have been fundamentally different from the liberal trading order that actually developed. Instead of the multilateral institutions like the World Bank and International Monetary Fund that America created, there would have been imperial trading blocs designed to benefit the metropolitan powers at the expense of the periphery. German economists during the war